à tout le monde d'être présent. Je pense que ceux qui me connaissent de près savent à quel point l'Australie est très près de mon cœur. Je dis toujours, la première fois que je suis allée en Australie, je crois que ça fait 6 ou 7 ans maintenant, lorsqu'on m'a donné un billet d'avion pour aller en Australie, pour aller juger un concours là-bas. J'étais contente, évidemment, parce qu'on est toujours contente d'aller découvrir des régions viticoles, mais j'avais pas la même excitation que d'avoir un billet pour aller en Italie ou en France, par exemple. Et mon Dieu, quand je suis arrivée en Australie, je voulais plus partir. Si j'avais été plus jeune dans ma carrière dans le vin, je pense que j'aurais tout quitté et je serais déménagée en Australie pour quelques années. Donc, j'ai eu le privilège d'y aller chaque année, sauf cette année avec les pandémies, depuis 7 ans, des fois quelques fois par année. Et plus j'y vais, plus je tombe en amour avec l'Australie. Malheureusement, à mon grand désarroi, les vins qu'on a ici au Québec ne représentent pas ce qu'on retrouve en Australie. Et je pense que lorsque je discute avec les agents, avec les sommeliers, avec les consommateurs aussi, on a encore cette idée des vins australiens, des vins avec des kangourous et des animaux sur les étiquettes, des vins fruités, pas hyper excitants, des produits de masse finalement. Alors qu'on est à Bordeaux ou en Italie ou partout ailleurs dans le monde, des vins de masse, il y en a aussi, mais c'est tellement autre chose. Puis l'Australie n'est pas différente. Donc, j'espère qu'aujourd'hui, on va vous donner le goût, si vous êtes moins familier avec le pays et les produits, d'aller faire vos devoirs. Vous êtes des agents et vous le savez en tant qu'agent, vous avez un pouvoir sur la SAQ parce que la SAQ regarde ce que les agents font, ce que les sommeliers achètent, puis après suivent un peu la tendance. Et ailleurs dans le monde, on a compris dans les marchés importants, on a compris à quel point l'Australie, c'est un pays qui était excitant, qui produisait des vins hyper au goût du jour, au fait. Mais pour une raison quelconque, le Québec, on ne l'a pas encore compris. Donc, j'espère qu'à la fin de cette heure-là, on va vous donner un petit peu la piqûre ou au moins le goût d'aller chercher ces vins-là puis les importer ici au Québec. Alors, je présente Marc Davidson. Marc Davidson, en fait, qui m'ont enseigné la raison que j'ai fait ce métier aujourd'hui, c'est Marc, parce que j'ai pris mon premier cours sur le vin il y a 20 ans et j'étais encore en musique à l'époque et c'était Marc qui était mon prof de sommellerie. Donc, je le connais depuis très, très longtemps et au premier cours de vin, bien, j'ai changé de carrière et j'ai continué. C'est un Australien qui a habité au Canada pendant très longtemps à Vancouver. Maintenant, il est basé aux États-Unis. Mais Marc, c'est lui qui enseigne, que le poste, il enseigne, c'est lui qui est représentant, pas représentant, mais c'est lui qui s'occupe, son titre officiel, c'est North America Wine Educator for Wine Australia. Alors, c'est un privilège de pouvoir animer avec Marc ce matin. Alors, Marc, welcome. We're so pleased to have you and take it for us.
Thank you. So now, if you spoke slowly in French, I would understand it. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to sit through the session today. And thanks for the introduction, Michelle. Extraordinary accent. Is that what I heard? Extraordinary Australian accent, someone said. Okay, good. So today, this presentation, I'm sure Michelle might have explained to you, this is going to be shared with you. There's a lot of information on the presentation that I'm not going to cover line by line. I will skip over certain things and just try to give you a sense of it. And there's a lot of preconceived ideas about any wine country or any wine region. Australia is no exception. I don't want to sort of dwell too much on the negative impressions people have about Australia. I'd hope today we can address those if need be, but I'd like to just look at the realities of Australia and what people are still kind of surprised about in circles that I think they shouldn't be surprised about. And that is those regionally expressive, interesting wines that I think make up Australia. And I think part of the problem is that the narrative around Australian wine has been Australian wine and not the regional expression. So hopefully today we can clarify a little bit of how we got to where we are today. A little bit of history I think is always helpful. And then talk about the realities of the evolution of Australian wine to today. So we're going to look, I'm going to give you a quick overview just for a minute or two on our education platform, which isn't in French, unfortunately. It is in English, but I will show you the links, and I think it's a lot of the presentation has been drawn from there, and it's a really valuable resource for people wanting to dig a little bit deeper into what's happening in Australia. Then we're going to do very much a sort of a 10,000 foot view of Australia today, if you like. History of grape growing and winemaking, just a brief overview of our sort of landscape and the key factors in influencing the characteristics of the regions and the varieties being grown there. And then we'll look at some of the major varieties and the regional expressions, regional styles, to the best of our ability. With no wine in front of us, it's one of the challenges with the pandemic. It's nice to do webinars. We can still remain connected, but how much nicer is it to be able to present, talk about a subject, and have that supported with what's in the glass? I think that's always more fun, but you know, this is what we have right now. Australian Wine Discovered, www.australianwinediscovered. That's our education platform. And the way it's broken down is there's a lot of valuable resource in here. There are 25 major comprehensive programs split into the topics, as you can see here, major varieties, so Australian grape varieties, the major regions. Now there's 65 of them in Australia, so we obviously weren't going to do most of these that are covered here are the regions that you will come across in the global market, and specifically in Quebec as well. And then just some topical things like old vines, alternative varieties, and there's some other subject matter in there. The cool thing about it is, though, when you get into the website, all of those presentations are available to download in PowerPoint, and they are editable. They're free and they're editable. So you can literally, if you were doing a presentation on, I don't know, global Grenache, for example, you could go into the Grenache presentation, pull out a slide on something relevant about Grenache in Australia, and throw it into your presentation. Or use it as is, but they're totally editable. Each slide has editable function. What would effectively be educators' guides are turned into a more detailed guide that correspond to the various presentations. It's just more information. So lots of additional tools and resources. You do need to sign up for the first time, but that doesn't change anything about the free nature of the program. You get unrestricted access. You can go in and out and take what you need and download. It's a free resource, which we're very proud of, and we think it's a great way to approach education, and it's very carefully curated and up-to-date information, which I think is great. How's my speed, Michelle? Do I need to slow down?
Marc demande, est-ce que vous comprenez? Est-ce qu'il parle trop vite? S'il parle trop vite, envoyez-moi une petite note sur le chat. Je vais lui dire d'aller tranquillement. Juste peut-être un rappel aussi d'éteindre vos caméras pendant qu'on enregistre. Merci.
Louis-Jacques will understand me. He's used to it. Quick history. I'm not going to go through this line by line. Well, I've got a slide that captures a lot of this, but just sort of to break down a few historical eras. I think important to remember, grapes did not exist in Australia. They had to be brought in. There's no such thing as native vines. Like North America, there are native vines, admittedly a challenge for quality wine production, but we didn't have grapevines in Australia. They were brought in. That happened in the late 1700s initially. But the real push for quality didn't happen until about sort of the early mid 1800s, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We then went into, and obviously it was a country being settled, so it took time for those colonies to expand, and then for grape growing and winemaking to expand with it. We then also had a period of time from the early 1900s to the 1940s, which was fortified. It was very much driven by the fact that in the UK, us being a colony of the UK initially, fortified wines were very popular in this time frame, and we were able to make very good quality ones and send them to Europe and also drink domestically. Not much produced not as much produced nowadays, but an incredible legacy and something for a different discussion, I think. But the history and evolution of the fortified wines in Australia is amazing. It's a wonderful story unto its own. From the 40s to 60s, I think it changed. The 1940s to 1960s, that's when people started to taste started to change, and more dry table wines, mostly reds in those days, started to become more and more popular. Culture changed, food and wine culture changed. Immigration was an important piece of that puzzle. And then through different decades from the 60s onwards, there's just been this evolution to what we have now in Australia, which is very much a wine drinking country. Per capita consumption is something like over 2 times that of the US, for example, where I live now. So it's very much a wine drinking culture. It's not maybe quite the same consumption levels of places like Portugal or France, but we are getting there. It's definitely on the rise, and wine is an everyday beverage for the table. So that's kind of cool. So just to sort of encapsulate some of these key historical points, which will be easier to go back on. Busby was considered to be the sort of forefather of viticulture in Australia. He went back to Europe. He was an immigrant that went back he didn't come over as a convict. He came over as an immigrant. Important distinction. In 1831, he went back to Europe and collected varieties. According to the records, 362 vines survived the journey, were planted. If you've been to Sydney near the Botanical Gardens, made cuttings of those to his property, which really was an important piece of the puzzle as well, simply because that now forms the foundation of all our wonderful old vine material. So there are areas in Australia that have not been affected by phylloxera. So if you look at the timing, phylloxera hit Europe in the 1860s. This was 30 years before. So all the original vine material that is still growing today and cuttings have been made from, a lot of the vine material is pre-phylloxera ungrafted material in Australia. So right now, I think Australia is probably the country on the planet where you can find the largest collection of pre-phylloxera old vine material, ungrafted old vine material, which I don't know that that's a quality determining statement, but I do think it's an interesting historical point of reference. A lot of people are quite surprised. I take sommeliers from the US and Canada down, they're looking at these old vines and wow, look at these things. How old are they? Oh, 120, 130 years. It's not easy to see that in other parts of the world. So I think it's a nice point, interesting point of difference. It is a big country. I know a couple of people have been. I know certainly Louis-Jacques, you've been, but looking at this, it's really interesting. We've got if you were to take sort of Perth to Sydney, that's like LA to New York. As a continent, we're about 4% smaller than continental US. So take Hawaii and Alaska out of that. So it's a big country, and we are spread out. The regions are spread out, but they are large in the southern part of the country, because the vast majority of Australia is categorically not suited to viticulture, just too hot and too dry, or frankly tropical in the north. So everything's in the south, and we'll talk about the factors that influence quality production there. I think this is an important, these next 2 slides I think are really interesting in the sense they give you a sense of scale with an overlay of Europe. You can see if you're in Margaret River, you are west of Portugal, and if you're in the Hunter Valley, you're east of Romania. It's a massive geographic spread. And quite often I think people look at Australia as a region, or I like Australian wines, it's a great region. It's like, well, Australia's a country. I still get people saying that to me. It's not a region, it's a country. So sometimes people say, what was the vintage like in Australia? It's like, I don't know. What was the weather like in America? So I think the narrative about Australia has to sort of shift a little bit. We will talk about those influences that cool things down. I think this is a really important slide. Our area under vine, I think because there's some big brands, and you see them in the Quebec market as well, Yellowtail, certainly not a criticism, they're big global brands, which give the impression that Australia is a massive producing country. Now, we're not insignificant, but we're not as big as people think. And if you were to combine all the area under vine in Australia, these numbers change from year to year, obviously, but right now we sit at around about 135,000 hectares. That's like Bordeaux and Burgundy combined. It's a little bit less. Or for that matter, it's almost exactly the same as the Languedoc. So we're talking about a couple or one region in France, not insignificant by no means. That's a decent amount of vineyard land, but I think the narrative makes it sound like, oh, we've just got these vast acres of, yeah, it's funny. I think that's a narrative that has to change. The biggest wine producing co-ops I've been to have been in Abruzzo in Italy or some places in France, not Australia, but yet the narrative about Australia always starts with, yes, you make all these big global brands, when The reality is there's, you know, close to 3,000 small to medium producers in Australia and 61 different regions and some sub-regions within. So cool map. I like this one. It really kind of sets the stage. Key things that moderate an otherwise warm climate. Australia overall is warm, but as Michelle can attest to, she had some chilly weather when she was in various parts of Australia in places that you don't expect. And I do take a certain amount of perverse pleasure taking sommeliers down there thinking it's all going to be hot. I don't tell them to underdress. I just don't tell them anything. And when they're freezing their asses off on a slope that's growing Riesling and they go, wow, I guess it's not always hot here. But the key things are, yep.
Sorry, I was going to say, and also at the same time, like I remember, you know, being in Sydney judging, and I was in my summer clothing, like it was 25, 26, and I flew to Tasmania, and when I landed, it was snowing. So the difference in temperature, it's not just cool in certain, it's just at the same time how different regions have a complete different climate.
Yeah, it is crazy. And I think the important thing is then you just talked about the further south you get, that's where we need to be for the most part. So latitude is very important. So we've got to get further south. There are a couple of exceptions up in Queensland. The maritime influence cannot be denied. It's a massive, if you think of what's just south of Australia, it's called the Southern Ocean. Next stop is Antarctica. And if you go the wrong way, you'll bump into that insignificant country called New Zealand, but that's another story. But no, I mean, it's those cold ocean breezes. And if anyone spent a lot of time there, and you can talk to any Australian when they say you'll be having a heat wave, which is common in Australia. And the common comment is, when will the southerly hit? And when they say that, what they mean is those southerly breezes will come in and drop the temperature anywhere from 15 to 30 degrees. And it's just this, welcome relief, you know. So that's a very, very important. Cold ocean breezes affect so many areas of Australia where quality viticulture is happening. The other important piece is elevation, and we'll try and address those pieces as we go along. These are some lovely maps to give you a sense of how the look and feel of the materials on the website, but obviously makes sense. These are minimum temperatures. You can see further south you get, obviously the colder it is. There's no mystery here. Further north you get from the equator in the northern hemisphere, the cooler it gets. So no surprises here. Rainfall mostly in these mountain ranges and around the edges, and also up north where it's tropical, but that doesn't really affect viticulture at all. It's just it's far too warm and not suited. Latitude we talked about, the cooling weather patterns we talked about. I can skip over that. Altitude and some of the geographical features I think are important. For every, this is not an Australian calculation. This is a general calculation. For every 100 meters, it's so nice to be talking to Canadians. I've lived in the US for now, and the metric system is still a mystery to Americans. I love it. For every 100 meters that you go up, you're dropping about 0.65 degrees Celsius overall temperature. So that is significant. So valley floor of Barossa going up to Eden Valley, we'll talk about difference of 200 or 300 meters. There's a difference in overall growing conditions. We do have some mountain ranges. Well, they're not Canadian style mountain ranges or European mountain ranges, but they're big and they have a significant impact on many of the growing regions. And I'll point some out in a moment. So you can see here the Great Dividing Range, which runs right up the east coast flank of Australia, affects so many regions and sort of finishing up in parts of Victoria. But I'm going to just highlight Mount Lofty ranges here because there's so many regions where this affects. This is a range that sits right now at about 750 meters at its highest. But the mere fact that that used to be Everest in proportion, we're going to talk about how old Australia is as a continent and an island, but it's geologically very old. Those mountain ranges used to be like Everest type proportions, but they're worn down, weathered down. Now, if they didn't exist even in their current state now, you would not have Barossa, McLaren Vale, Adelaide Hills, Clare Valley, and a couple of other regions there. That would likely be ocean meets desert, which over here on the sort of western side of South Australia, that's what it looks like. Literally a desert straight to the ocean. So those are so mountain ranges can't be denied in terms of important for quality viticulture. I'll skip through these. They're just a couple of slides you can look at to see the differences in climates across the country and how they can be classified. For continental climate, there's several regions that would be considered continental. Maritime, there's many regions that are affected by that. And separating maritime off from Mediterranean, that's sort of a warmer and slightly drier, is Barossa, Geograph, McLaren Vale, Margaret River. So, I mean, there's, you know, you can see that's not just, and I think also a lot of the wines that have been seen, and especially in Canada and certainly in the US, have been warmer climate wines. I think people do get the impression that Australia is warm, therefore the wines are full and they're rich. That absolutely exists, and I don't ever want that to go away. That's part of Australia's narrative, but there are so many. I think it's something like, of the 65 regions, 23 of them are as moderate as Bordeaux or colder. So we've got a good third of our regions are actually, you know, borderline classified, sort of cool, sort of moderate maritime to cool maritime. So soils, I love the old world, new world discussion in wine. It's an increasingly irrelevant way of looking at the wine world. It was certainly relevant back when it was developed, but I think geologically speaking, Europe is new world and Australia is old world. The soils and the geology that exist in Australia are crazy. As a land mass, we've been separate and separated off from what would have been Gondwana, I think is how they called it. It was separated off from Africa. Likely, obviously there's some supposition in there, but it's been a separate island for 100 million years, which has given rise to some of the craziest looking creatures on the planet. Platypus, kangaroo, for example. But the mere fact that it's very, very old. So, and again, none of this is quality determining, but I do think it's very interesting. Some of the oldest soils, oldest geological elements you can find on the planet exist in Australia. There are some great vineyard sites that you'd be familiar with that sit on 450, 500, 600 million years old. So Burgundy, I think, is 4 million. So not that that's, again, it's not a quality determining thing, but it's just interesting. And I think the work that has to be done now and is slowly being done is this deciphering within each region. There's such complexity within each region. Let's take a region we do probably know quite well, Alsace. We always talk about how complex Alsace soils are. It's like a quilt of different things within just one region. Absolutely true of almost every region in Australia. There's so much diversity within each region and between each region, and that work is being done slowly but surely. And we can maybe address it when we start talking about some of the varieties of McLaren Vale. They've done some good work there. Usually, when I ask people, "Can you name a soil type connected to a region and a variety?" Anywhere I've asked this in my global role when I was working with Wine Australia globally, everyone says Coonawarra. That's it. It's the only region people can say, yes, the Terra Rossa soils of Coonawarra, which is fantastic for Coonawarra. But that sort of presumes that there's no other good viticultural soils in Australia, yet there's 10 million year old blue slate in Clare Valley. There's beautiful sandy soils in subsections of McLaren Vale, which are really significant. So work has to be done. It didn't take Burgundy a couple of 100 years to get there. It took them a lot longer. And that's where that's the stage we're at right now. We don't have monks, but you know, we're still working at it.
Wow.
Major regions. This is more just a map to point out the kind of regions that you're likely to see in the export markets, to be honest. It's not that, you know, Peracuta, which is a tiny region in New South Wales, isn't significant. You're just not going to see it. So these are the major regions that we're looking at. Varieties and styles, and I want to be able to sort of, throughout this, I'd rather skip through some of the details on the slides and try and just capture what's kind of cool about these varieties and how they've evolved. And I think if we can even, I mean, and Michelle, I know you can jump in and talk about the nature of Australians, because I do think involved in terroir and the evolution of any region is how people think. And I think it's a really important piece of the puzzle. Yeah, I don't quite know how to capture it in my own words. I think it's an important piece of how we were settled, how we've developed as a country, has given a very interesting attitude. And I think that's what makes Australia incredibly exciting right now.
I would say open-minded. Like I always say that I never drink as much Burgundy as when I go to Australia. You know, you judge all day, and then at the end of the day, you go to someone's hotel room and everyone gather to share their bottle. Nobody drinks Australian wine. I mean, what they want to share and discuss is other wines. And I think what's made the success of Australia is a combination of being open-minded understanding what the market wants, and maybe now, in Quebec, they're still suffering from that, because at a time when we wanted those lush and fruity wines, it was successful, and they pushed that. Unfortunately, in Quebec, we're still stuck with those wines, even though Australia has long moved on. Yes, it still exists, but I think that they were really saying, okay, that style is successful on the export market, but there's so much more, and we need to show that. And I think, and then we moved on to, in some ways, wanting to emulate styles, trying to copycat, whether it was Norton Rhone for Syrah, or whether it was Burgundy for whites in reds. And I think now they understood that, wait a second, we have learned, we do vintages, in other parts of the world. We've learned from the others, but I think Australia is in a place right now, it's so exciting, because after getting all that knowledge, they're really finding their own place and finding that, yeah.
Absolutely perfect. And I think sometimes an outsider sees it better than I do, because I'm a bit too close to it. But I do think that's a really great way of looking at it, because I do think there was a period of time where we were trying to make, and you heard it, and I think it would be unfair to say you don't still hear it. But I find it funny that, it's like, we're making a more Rhone style Shiraz. It's more like a Syrah, or we're making, we've got the oldest Shiraz vineyards on the planet. So why are we still comparing? But I think it's normal. You go to the benchmark places. And I think there was a period of time where people were trying to make Chardonnay like Burgundy, Pinot like Burgundy, Shiraz and Grenache like the Rhone Valley. And I think now this understanding of it all is, I think there's a confidence in Australia now that's great. We absolutely know what's happening. As Michelle mentioned, when you're in Australia, all these guys are drinking everything from everywhere, not because they don't like Australian wines, just that they want to understand what's going on elsewhere, but not to emulate now. They want to use that as inspiration rather than for emulation, and now go back to Yarra Valley, to their vineyard sites, to say, knowing what I know now about Pinot Noir globally, what's the best way to do things here in Yarra? And I think that's why the wines are shining. They're not being, it's like, I don't know, you can't make a Rhone style, a successful Rhone style Shiraz or Syrah in Barossa. There might be places, little vineyard sites, but why would you take away from what Mother Nature delivers you, which is ripeness and full flavor? That's what you get. It's like Chateauneuf du Pape. You can't make something lean in Chateauneuf du Pape. You have what you have. So.
And I think if I just may add something, I remember having a great discussion with James Holliday. For those who read books, James Holliday is the most prominent wine critic in Australia, and he wrote a lot of different, I don't know, over 50 books, lots. And I remember having a discussion with him over dinner, and he was saying to me, Michelle, James Busby came with all of those vines back in the days in the 1800s because he went to Europe, because he went to France. But what if he had been to Greece or Italy? We would have a different heritage now. And what he was saying to me is like, now we have to look at what we have, and does it still work? Are those the best? And from what he brought, which clone works better? And maybe in some area, the grapes we planted, because it was from James Busby's collection, maybe they're not suited anymore, and we have to relook at this. And again, it speaks to the openness, and you can see that when you visit regions. It speaks to the openness of the Aussie. They're not stuck. They're really quick to adapt and willing to look at possibilities. And I think not many wine country in the world have that. Certainly not in Europe. They're very stuck generally in terms of what was there, where Australians have that openness, which is amazing.
Yeah. And I think there's a healthy respect for tradition in Australia, but absolutely not bound and constricted by that tradition. They're always going to experiment and play around, and we'll get through the major varieties, and Michelle and I will have a discussion with you about the really cool stuff. Like if you're in McLaren Vale right now eating seafood, local seafood, you're drinking Fiano or Vermentino from McLaren Vale, and you go, what are you talking about? Nah, it's been like that for the last 15 years. So, which is cool. So anyway, Michelle and I know how to talk, so if we keep this up, we won't get through the rest of this. But very quickly, I think looking at some of the classic white varieties, but I would argue Chardonnay and Pinot Noir next, which we'll look at, would be two classic varieties that have history in Australia that have evolved so dramatically in the last 20 years that they are virtually unrecognizable from where they were. It is the most planted variety in Australia. The old school, it was actually Chardonnay that put Australia on the global media map, not Shiraz. People think Shiraz, obviously. It was a Chardonnay, the Rosemount Roxburgh Chardonnay back in a competition, the international wine competition in London, and everyone went, wow. And I mean, this was a wine that was deep, dark yellow. It was so oaky, you legitimately were pulling splinters of wood out of your mouth. It was crazy. Not necessarily different from what was going on in California, but that was this big impression and people get excited. Structural complexity, nah. Pineapple fruit, yeah, it was all about that. And that followed through for a decade or so until we all got used to the fact that, well, we're actually drinking wine more frequently, and this is exhausting. We can't continue. So there's been a massive evolution, and where that came in really simple terms, it was about getting better clonal material in. So the real good Dijon clones didn't come in till the mid-90s in Australia, having vine age and having them in the right place, and probably maybe more importantly, I mean, I think that's really important, how to make it, recognizing that oak is actually a maturation vessel and not a major flavor component. I think a lot of things had to change, and I think that's what's made Australian Chardonnay right now so exciting. And I can't tell you the amount of blind tastings I've done with people where and you see it. I mean, I sat the MW exam, tasting exam, and I know people doing all sorts of study programs. When you get good Aussie Chardonnay in the blind lineup, it is really hard.
It's really hard, and it's funny because when I say that, people are always skeptical, and I do it. And I did it to someone highly recognized in the world lately, and same thing. They called Meursault, which was Margaret River, right? And I think, Mark, you were speaking of evolution. I think to me, if you ask one grape that carries the history the best, to me, it's Chardonnay in some ways, because it really shows the evolution to its full, to the full history. It started like being, because you're saying they understood how to make it, maybe, but we have to remember that at the time, that's what consumer wanted. They wanted those, they were popular from California, from Australia, and Australia knew that, and they were, they were kind of going with it. But obviously people got tired of it, as the Aussie did, and they understood. But today, if you ask me what is your favorite grape from Australia, I will drink Chardonnay from Australia all day long, because A, it's so well done. B, you see the diversity of the region. And I think, you cannot say that the Chardonnay from Margaret River is the same than from Tasmania or Yarra Valley. It's all very different. And also, and I'm talking to the importers now, I love Burgundy. The reason I do this is because I fell in love with Burgundy. But right now, the wines of Burgundy that are good, that we all love, they're very difficult to find at a good price, more than ever. And I think if you work in a restaurant, by the time you put your Meursault on the list, it's a very expensive proposition for the consumer, where you can find some really good Chardonnay from Australia that are competitive and can offer that very similar expression. Obviously, it's from Australia, but the consumer, if you serve it blind and you just say, hey, have a try of this, and you don't tell them what it is, I promise they're going to love it. And that's my little promotion for Chardonnay, because it's a frustration not to find them on the shelf at the SAQ, or not to find them. So please, dear importer who are there and listening, if you need some help to find producer, we will help you, but it needs to be a representation, because I think it can offer there's a room for it right now in the market.
Agreed. I'll pass over this because we've sort of addressed what the style and the evolution, but I do think a few moments on just these different expressions. Chardonnay is grown everywhere in Australia. It's legitimately, is it all good there, Michelle?
Yeah, sorry, I lost you. You're back.
Okay. Oh, really? Okay. Chardonnay's grown everywhere. It's one of those lovely varieties we know globally. It can grow in warm climates. You could overcrop it to make fun, affordable, easy drinking wines. That's true of parts of Australia, California, and pretty much anywhere. But really good quality Chardonnay, you need to be in a moderate climate. You need to have that sort of restraint. And I think if I was to pick 6 regions, this would be the 6 regional expressions that pay attention to search out, and very, very, very quickly, I think I still think, you know, you've got to be fairly expert to be able to pick the very different regional expressions every time. Without a doubt, I reckon 9 times out of 10, I'll pick Margaret River, because there is this Meursault-ish sort of quality to it. There's this power and richness and mouthfeel.
It's more voluptuous. And if I may add just one little thing, there's also the clone, right? We talk about the ginger clone, which is a clone that the grape is smaller and you have more skin to juice ratio. And so it produces more power in some ways, combined with the climate and everything else. And also I find that in other parts of Australia, malolactic, whether you do it or not, is very much discussed, whether you should do it or you should not do it. Where I think the style of that of the ginger clone, it leads naturally to malolactic. So most producers actually do full malo, so it does give that richer style also.
Yeah, it's funny because that clone is weird in that you get an uneven berry set, so you get big ripe berries and underripe berries within the bunch, which is, I think, what gives you the richness. You get this lovely mouthfeel, but you get this underlying acidity that is very sneaky. It's like a spine of lime-like acidity that runs through the veins of every Margaret River Chardonnay, and some obviously some classic examples. But yeah, these are regions to have a look at. And you know, as you know, you can always reach out to Michelle or myself after the presentation and for any additional explanation, but I'm just mindful that we may not get through this presentation at this rate. So we'll keep going. I am in wine because of Pinot Noir. I was getting excited about wine, working in a restaurant, buying wines out of a cellar, a very good cellar. The owner let us buy them at cost, and we were just sort of learning a bit. And I remember it was a bottle of Chambord-Musigny, Village Chambord-Musigny from 1971 from Leroy, and I literally swore at it because I was like, what the is this? I've never had something like this before in my life. I had wine that I like to taste, and then I had something that made me feel something, and Pinot Noir's done that for me. And so I'm always happy to talk about Pinot Noir from anywhere. In fact, I make excuses for shitty Pinot Noir just because it's my first love. But the reality is that I think it's one of those varieties right now that's incredibly exciting in Australia and very much unknown. And I think that the immediate impression would be Pinot Noir in a hot climate like Australia. It's like, well, you get genuine, beautiful expressions now of Pinot Noir, and it had the same evolution in a way in that it's been in Australia for a long time. The original clone that came from Clos Vougeot, they call it MV6. Then we got all the Dijon clones in, and that's been a really important piece of the equation, but it's also made people go back and look at MV6 again, because actually it's a heritage clone. That it's come from Clos Vougeot means nothing now because it's been so long in Australia and it's adapted to the climate. And you talk to certain producers and they say it's actually really cool. So the clonal discussion is important. But I think the expression of Pinot Noir right now in Australia, it's very difficult to find, or you have to look very hard for commercial examples to find a big, full, rich Pinot Noir the way you can sometimes find in California. They are medium, lightweight to medium bodied at the max. Very perfumed, very aromatic, and I think it's a really exciting time.
And I think, Mark, also what I find is Chardonnay, maybe because it's a bit more adaptable to a lot of different climates.
Totally.
As much as I love it, I do find that there's a lot of link to Burgundy still, where I find that with Pinot Noir, it's very much Australia. You cannot compare it to Burgundy because the climate is different. And you were talking about the MVC, the clone that has adapted. And because it's so finicky in the vineyard, it's not as adaptable to Chardonnay. You can't really go around and trying to do something else. You have to go with it. And I think that I agree with you. It's so exciting to see the Pinot that we're seeing from the Yarra and the Mornington Peninsula and another area, because it is truly from Australia. Like, it's really, really unique.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was at an event in California a while ago, the top 100 wineries of the world for Wine and Spirits magazine. And it was interesting because some guy made some comment about Pinot Noir from Australia, and it was perfect because Bindi was side by side with Felton Road. And New Zealand, I love New Zealand. I make jokes about that, but I love it. I love what's going with Pinot Noir there. But Otago is not cool climate. Those wines are quite big and quite rich and quite full. And I said to this guy, okay, cool. Why don't you go to New Zealand, quote unquote, cool climate, try Felton Road, try Bindi right next door, and you come back and tell me which wine comes across as cool climate. And he just was like, okay, got it. This is, you know, the restraint and the perfume is very different. But yeah, anyway, we've sort of covered a little bit about these styles and characteristics. And then I think it is a bit, I mean, certainly when I first, because I'd lived away from Australia for a long time and was working as a sommelier in Canada, there was a period of time where I would say with Pinot Noir in the early 90s, I would pick a few from Australia saying, hey, have a look at these, because I was a bit nervous. But now it's like, go knock yourself out, just try whatever you want. But this is you know, we could certainly pick, and there's a bunch of regions in here I would add, but I'm saying if you look at the top 4 in terms of export and just accessibility, Adelaide Hills, which is in South Australia, so it's elevation there that you can get. Mornington, Tasmania, and Yarra Valley. I think they would be the top 4 to sort of, at least at this early stage, pay attention to. With Yarra Valley probably right now having the sort of history and reputation in the export markets. But Tasmania is exciting. Michelle and I often we talked about this the other day, in that the Mornington might actually, I think, have the most regional, sort of consistent regional expression. I was going to say homogenous, but that sounds negative, and I don't mean it to be. What I mean is that there seems to be something clearly identifiable about Mornington. I think it's because of the way that region sits. It doesn't have major elevation differences. There just seems to be a structure of acidity and tannin that I think is quite consistent. Tasmania, it's a big island, depends where you are. Adelaide Hills, again, elevation, different elevation, and Yarra Valley is probably 3 sections to it. So the styles are quite different, but I think there is a vein of something similar in Mornington that I think is really cool. But 4 regions that definitely, and Tasmania, what is it about Tasmania that people love? I mean, aside from the fact that it was snowing and Michelle froze.
I don't know. I mean, I do feel like this, when you go, I do feel like it's kind of this untouched land. There's something quite mystical I find about it. And also they're isolated. They always talk about Australia like as the mainland, right? They don't feel like they're part of Australia almost. And you kind of feel that in the wine, where there's an austerity in it that I find. And maybe it's not as homogeneous as you were saying with Mornington Peninsula, but I think what you find constantly is that slight austerity in the wine, and the spine is a bit leaner because of that cool, even though you have obviously a bit different depending, because it is big. But I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with Tasmania with time, because I find they're still trying to manage that cool leanness and adjust with the oak. And you do find some amazing wine, but I find even producer who started 5 or 6 years ago and you try them now, it's so much better. So I find it's still constantly improving.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. But yeah, it is a very special place, and I mean, there's lots of great places to visit in Australia, but man, Tasmania is something else. It legitimately is like going to another world, in that it's green and it's sort of quite English looking. It's really quite funny.
Yeah.
There's a very, very English feel to it. And yeah, it was set a little, actually all the bad criminals were sent there strangely. So Tasmania has a really interesting history in terms of its evolution. I loved it. I mean, honestly, I've been 2 times, and it's the first place I always want to go back to. It's magic. So, but Pinot Noir, it's something to look at, and I quite often I might want to address just a little bit about price points here, because that sometimes happens with top Chardonnay and top Pinot in Australia, where I've had this over the last 18 months in seminars and presentations, and there'll be $50, $60, $70 bottles that I'm showing people, and someone will say, yes, but for that money I can get Burgundy. My answer is twofold. One is actually, no, you can't, because I think Burgundy's got up to the point for quality, and I don't think it's possible. But then at a certain point, we need to stop making the comparisons, even though I'm in the wine business because of Burgundy. It holds a very special place in my heart, and I think it is very unique. But if you're drinking Burgundy, you're not drinking Tasmanian Pinot, or you're not drinking Mornington Peninsula. And I think that's the key thing. It's not just about Burgundy anymore. Yeah, great Burgundy, we get it. But there's great Pinot from so many other parts of the world right now that you can have that discussion and be confidently saying, yeah, but Mornington's different. It's not like Burgundy, it's Mornington, and it's worth paying good money. There's no such thing as good, cheap Pinot. If I see cheap Pinot, I get excited, and then I get suspicious almost immediately. There's no such thing, good Pinot takes time and it's expensive. So just a point where those regions were, not that maybe this is a bit obvious, but Tasmania down here, obviously Yarra Valley sneaking in here, and then a little peninsula down here is Mornington Peninsula. Yeah, so I think, and then, and Adelaide Hills over here in South Australia, but that's about elevation. So for the most part, cool climate, very much informing where they do well. Here's Mornington down here that we were talking about, this little peninsula, ocean on three sides, essentially.
Covered a lot with cloud, eh? It's often cloudy and...
Yeah. And really, I mean, you've got the Southern Ocean here, just south of Mornington here. Yeah. Southern Ocean, rough, crazy seas. And yeah, it's a pretty beautiful place too. Yeah, anyway, you can surf in the morning, make wine in the afternoon. Pretty nice lifestyle.
Life, eh? That's the life.
Yeah. Looking at this map here, you can see where the zones are, but it's really interesting because Michelle and I have a colleague we know well, Mac Forbes, who has purchased land, because right over here on this western side of Tasmania, it's all very harsh and kind of like, you know, it's a big rain shadow, if you like, the big mountain range here. So on certain sides of it, people think, too cool, you'll never grow grapes there. But with climate change, I think that's where some expansion's happening, and we know someone that's bought a vineyard there or bought some land there and is planting. Mac Forbes, guy from the Yarra Valley, is playing around with the land.
And it's one of the reasons, like if you ask Mac why he bought there, climate change is one of the major reasons.
Yeah. And then there's Tasmanian devils. How cute is this little guy? Come on. That's before they get too old. They get old and then they get aggressive and they get quite stinky, but they're quite cute at this particular age.
Outstanding, beautiful, incredible.
So, Riesling, perhaps this is something that you do know of, but I do think it's worth revisiting Riesling because I think just that history and the style is so steadfastly planted, and I think it's kind of interesting. Michelle was saying how there's like zero Riesling. She couldn't find a Clare or Eden Valley Riesling at the SAQ recently, and it's sort of funny because in Australia, I mean, maybe this is not a fair comparison, but every restaurant you go to, either by the glass or by the bottle, there's Riesling. It's almost like saying if you've got Australian wines on your list and you don't have a Riesling, it's like saying, well, I've got French wines on my list and I don't have Chablis. Not the best comparison, but you know what I mean? It's that important to us in terms of aperitif drinking, in terms of food friendliness, and yeah.
Right. So, someone has their phone open and they're speaking on the phone. So if you could maybe just turn your phone off. Si vous pouvez éteindre votre téléphone, s'il vous plaît. Il y a quelqu'un qui est au téléphone et qu'on entend.
We're getting a song though. That was kind of cool.
Right. Sorry.
But anyway, Riesling, lovely history and evolution of Riesling, but and I think the key thing, dry. And you know, people think about Riesling in Australia, it's changed and it's evolved, but there's no question dry Riesling is very, very important. I think, yeah, we can talk about the style and how it evolves. You can look at this slide on your own, but I think what to look for, I think in terms of regional expressions, the two that would be most known in amongst the sommelier community and possibly the agent community would be Clare Valley and Eden Valley. No question that these are the benchmark styles. Clare Valley may be arguably being more important, but that lime-like, very unique expression, and it's one of those things that nowadays, you know, you talk to a lot of people that have had enough experience. That's what you want in a blind tasting. If it's a Riesling tasting, you want that because it's like getting Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. It's a freebie, you know. But once you've had it, because it is so uniquely Australian, I know it now. It's like, oh, that's Australia, but where in Australia is another way to look at it. Eden Valley and Clare Valley are different. I find there's probably more similarities than differences. But that lemon lime note that runs through the veins of both those regions, I think is consistent and I think absolutely beautiful. But other parts of Australia are emerging with really cool styles, sometimes texturally a little bit different. Over in Great Southern, you get a very sort of still a citrus element, but it's more orange, sort of more orange zest and what have you. Canberra District, Tasmania, Southwestern Victoria, there's some really lovely expressions that sometimes I think texturally slip away from, I mean, I love Clare, but in the same way that you drink Clos Seigneur when it's young, There's definitely an element of pain associated with the pleasure when they're young. They hurt a little bit. I think Claire sometimes is that way. It's a bit lean, a bit tart, and obviously with time it evolves into this amazing thing. But sometimes drinking wine Rieslings from other parts of Australia are where you get a little bit more accessibility and what have you. But Michelle, I'm sure you've got some stuff to add about Riesling. I know
Well,
you love it.
I mean, I think, I think with food, we have this thing, I think with Riesling, especially consumers still, regardless of what we're trying to do. I know there's an obsession with sugar in Quebec. People go to the SAQ and they look at the residual sugar, and then that's how they buy their wine. It's pretty crazy. And I think that with Riesling, with Riesling in Australia, I think if you're trying to introduce consumer to dry Riesling, that's the place to go, because it's going to be dry. I mean, there's a few producers playing a little bit of dry, but generally, the trend always has been mostly dry Riesling. And you're right, when you try a Clare Valley it is truly painful. Like, it's like, oh my God, I love acidity, but you need food with it. And I just love the Aussie. When you go there's a lot of Asian and French foods. Of course, it's the magic pairing, but also when they bring you a tray of oysters, often they will serve lime rather than lemon with it. So you have like oysters with a piece of lime, and then you have Riesling with it. Oh my God, like it's absolutely delicious, and it's affordable too. It's not, yes, you have the Jeffrey Grosset of this world who have the really high-end Riesling, but you have a lot of Eden Valley and Clare Valley, at a decent price, at a really affordable price.
Top producers for $18 to $20.
Yeah.
Canadian, 18 to 25 Canadian. It's crazy. It is.
And it is cooler. I mean, I think we always kind of sarcastic from the trading. We look at Australia and say, yeah, it's cool. It's not really cool. Yes, it is cool. It was snowing when I went to Tasmania. And I remember being with Mark in Eden Valley. And Eden Valley is part of the Barossa zone. And we were in Barossa, which is not very far away. It's so you have Barossa zone, and the zone is divided between Barossa Valley and Eden Valley. So it's very close. And we were with a group in Barossa, and we drove to Eden Valley, which was about 20 minutes. And when we got to Eden Valley, it was cool. We were all in like summer clothes. And the woman from Pucivel, Jane, made a point. She opened the back of her truck with all of the Riesling in the back of her truck. And it's raining at this point. And we're like, can we go back down and try? She's like, no, I want you to remember that here it's cool, and it's not like Barossa. It's like, yeah, I haven't forgotten, because I drank wine for 2 hours under the rain. So it is much cooler.
Yeah, and that's the vineyard you were talking about. This is Pucivel right here is where we stood for that. And we've done it with oysters up on the hill at Clare Valley, and wind whistling up there, and people say, okay, I get the point. It's cold here. Can we go inside now? But it's awesome. And that, like you say, oysters and Riesling in Australia, it's pretty much a standard thing. And that's why I made the Chablis comparison sometimes, because I think, that's our Chablis, if you like, although I don't like that comparison necessarily. But no, Riesling definitely, to my mind, and the varieties we're looking at today are just like, man, if you're talking Australian wines, these are benchmarks, and these are the sorts of things that are necessary. Quick look at Grenache. This is my pet little thing right now. I love this variety. I don't think I was ever going to say this necessarily. I always liked it, but I think the way it's been grown and sometimes the way it was expressed, I think in Australia it was always a bit heavy, used in fortifieds. There's been just an absolute evolution of style with people. I think this is happening globally. It's particularly happening it's been happening for the last 10 to 12 years in McLaren Vale, and slowly Barossa too. But man, just this, if you really start to understand varietal Grenache and what it's capable of producing, it's just so exciting. And I think it's always this variety that's, yes, I remember meeting the head of the Institute of Masters of Wine many years ago. He's since passed away, so I can say this. He said, oh, Grenache, yes, and a bit of a coarse variety, isn't it? Meaning not a classic, where I look at this, and now what we're seeing is what we thought Grenache fit into this box over here, which was full-bodied and quite sort of alcoholic and rich, and it's a much broader spectrum to these more ethereal, aromatic, almost Pinot Noir-like qualities through to the quite full bodied. And now when I see Grenache that's deep, dark, and concentrated, I get nervous because that to me isn't really Grenache. There are more common denominators with Pinot in a way, and it's thin-skinned, susceptible to disease. It just needs warm climate to grow as opposed to Pinot needing cool. Not the easiest comparison, but the reality is Grenache right now, there's some wines that have completely shaken my world when I tried one producer, and we'll talk about him in a moment, where I'm like, what is this? This is 13%. I think it was 12.9 or 13% alcohol, perfumed, aromatic, fresh. And I was like, damn, I've not experienced this before. But you're seeing it in France, you're seeing it in Spain, you're seeing it in other places too. So this is exciting.
But I think in some ways, Australia, I always said Australia, to my surprise, is the country who made me fall in love again with Grenache. Because I don't know that it's happening so much in Spain, Mark. Like the style you're talking about, I really think, if I may,
I just had one the other day, so I was like,
okay,
maybe it's happening, maybe not as much.
I think in Spain, when it happened, it's still the exception. Where in Australia, they're on board. I mean, they ferment to cooler temperature, often whole bunches, and so the winemaking style also, in addition of really isolating specific sites, but I think that the vinification technique made it so that, there's no more oak, and you have that freshness, that brightness that you have.
Yeah, and I think oak for me, it's one of those funny varieties which for me, oak is still used, but old oak, and you see it so much. And I don't know why this is the case, but for some reason, new oak and Grenache, it doesn't work. It sits like you need it with Pinot, carefully done. It just sits on the top with Grenache. I don't know what that is. It just it doesn't work. Old oak works for the the polymerization of tannins and what have you. But yeah, two major regions to look for. It's Barossa and McLaren Vale. These are the places where there's the most Grenache is being grown. And I would argue McLaren Vale's evolution of Grenache and McLaren Vale, everyone's looking to them and going, okay, what are you guys doing here? We will emulate that. And that's happening in Barossa. It took a little more time in Barossa, more and more of those expressions, not taking away from the bigger, fuller, richer ones. I love that style. It needs to remain, but so nice to be able to pick up a bottle that is, lower in alcohol, fresh and juicy, that you want to drink on a daily basis and put it in the fridge for 10 minutes. It's like, yeah, this is cool. It's juicy, fresh, easy drinking. I love it. It's great. And everything in between.
I also
Old
think
vines.
the climate is a bit different in Barossa. I mean, it's hot. It's hot, where in McLaren Vale you have the influence of the ocean and you have also the altitude. So I also think it contributes to that kind of fresher style.
And all this old vine material, this is a wonderful vineyard to visit. It's all grown on sand. Where is the sandy soiled site that I can think of for Grenache in the Rhone? There's a few. But look at the sand here. This is literally like walking on a beach. Those vines were planted in 1848. Crazy. Still producing today. And that's only about, I think that's 4 hectares. It's not a big site. And then I point out this side of, these were planted in the 40s. This is Okota barrels. And I just put that in there simply because, number one, you drink Okota barrels Fugazi Grenache, you fall in love with this wine and you go, wow. You meet Taras Okota, man, woman, or animal, you fall in love with Taras Okota. He is impossible to dislike. He is one of the great characters in our wine business. And I just love him. And his attitude is magnificent. So yeah. There you have it. I'm looking at the time and going, wow, we can talk. Shiraz, we have to address Shiraz. It is absolutely our iconic variety, and a bit maligned in some ways, in the sense that people got bored. So much Shiraz was foisted upon them, so many styles in a similar vein, either cheap and cheerful, easy drinking, or big and concentrated. And I think, unfortunately, what got lost in the shuffle is these truly wonderful regional expressions. And I could literally sit with you with 6 wines. I could probably do it with more would be better, but I could give you 6 wines that will completely change your mind about what's possible. I love, outside of Burgundy, I remember falling in love with Côte Rôtie when visiting and just going as a young sommelier. I was like, what is it? There's something that Côte Rôtie has. You have power and intensity, but you've got delicacy and fragrance, and it walks this unbelievable tightrope of those 2 components that exists in Australia. And I love Northern Rhone. I love Syrah grown in all parts of the world, but there is absolutely no region nor country on the planet that can do what we can do with this variety.
Wow.
If you get the full expression, there's no one doing that. But
Yes.
everyone thinks it sits here with big and full and rich, and unfortunately, it's so far from the truth.
And if I may tell a story quickly, and I know we're moving on time, but when I was one of Mark's students back in the days, long time ago, he did a tasting in Vancouver at the wine festival where we had 200 people in the room, all from the trade, importers, sommeliers, and we had Shiraz, Syrah from all over the world mixed together blind. I think we had 24 wines, and we had to kind of taste and pick, right where we thought it was from. And we got to this wine, and he was asking wine after wine. When we got to this wine, Mark asked, who thinks this is from France? Who thinks this is from Australia? And everyone in the room, except me, because I had tasted it before, so I recognized it, but everyone in the room said it was from Côte Rôtie, and it was from Canberra. It was Clanicula, and it tasted like Côte Rôtie. It was like that freshness and that brightness and
perfume.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful, and I think with my work, I've been doing this now for 10 years with Wine Australia, and a lot of the time I've stayed away from Shiraz, not because I wanted to, it's just that people were bored. They needed to hear about other things in Australia. Right now, I'm doing a lot more work with Shiraz because people are excited about it again, and it's a really cool thing. And as I say, like 4 to 6 wines I could show you that would completely change your mind if indeed you haven't already experienced this. But when you go into liquor store shelves or you see what's in the market, I understand why people think this about Shiraz because that's what's mostly seen. However, the reality is quite different. Oh man, picking regions where great Shiraz is grown is difficult. I think we know Barossa, we know McLaren Vale, but there's so many cool areas in and around that can produce full flavored and really elegant and rich styles. Adelaide Hills, Canberra District, Grampians. I mean, there's other places to sort of explore as well. And there's a change too, that I think it's really important to understand the evolution in this variety as well. Because while I think we talk about Shiraz and Chardonnay and Pinot evolving, Shiraz has changed a lot too. And even in a classic area like Barossa, you can't get away from the fact that the wines are full bodied and they're flavorful. But what we are seeing more so in Barossa nowadays as a warm climate region, there's a freshness that exists. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but what I mean by that is that they're doing a lot of really good work about capturing the right sort of picking times, either picking a bit earlier to capture that sort of fragrance that still exists and not waiting too long so that the fruit's a bit more dead and sort of almost prune-like, which might have happened a little bit more in the past. Whereas now I'm drinking, like modern Barossa to me has the power and the intensity and the richness and the spice of Barossa, but there's this beautiful purity of fruit that I think exists. And I find that an exciting thing. I'm not always in the mood for reaching for a big full bodied Barossa Shiraz, but there are times of the year where I want it, and I'm more excited to drink it now than ever before.
And Mark, I think 2 things to remember. One, those wines can age because when they're young and they're generous, you forget. And then, when I was a poor student, I had some in my cellar. And when I moved back to Montreal, I found those bottles that I have forgotten I had. And I had bought them for like $15, $20 at the time. And oh my God, I wish I had bought some more. They have what it takes to age and they become so beautiful. And the other thing I want to add to what you're saying is, going back to the very beginning of your presentation when you said, it's a big country. And it's like never we would compare, within the Northern Rhone, we don't say you're drinking Syrah from the Rhone. We'll say you're drinking Côte Rôtie or Saint-Joseph or Hermitage. And I think it's exactly the same thing. You cannot say Australian Shiraz. If you're saying that, there's something you're missing out. You're missing out. You haven't understood what it's about because it is definitely just the same where it's different from where you are.
I have a slide when I'm talking Shiraz. I usually have a slide that has 3 things or 3 statements on it. It says American Cabernet, French Pinot Noir, Australian Shiraz. And I said, what's wrong with this slide? What's wrong with it is there's 2 things we don't say, and there's 1 thing we do say. One of them is Australian Shiraz. We don't say French. I like French Pinot. I don't really hear that. I don't say, I love American Cab. Everyone goes to a place. They go to California, most likely Napa or Sonoma or somewhere. And same with Pinot in France. You say, I love Burgundy. But here we still say Australian Shiraz. What the heck does that mean? I'm pushing for the fact that there is no such thing as Australian Shiraz.
Yeah, you're right.
So, but yeah, anyway, lots of stuff to explore there. This is a beautiful shot of the Barossa. This is a Shiraz Vineyards near Bethany, which is a little sub-district of Barossa. And here's the famous Hill of Grace, planted in 1860 and still producing, I would argue, this and Mount Edelstone from both from Henschke. These are categorically the most brilliant, unique, single vineyard expressions of Shiraz in Australia or of any wine on the planet. I think they're amazing. I was with Michelle at Henschke and she cried. Not because of anything I said or did, but just because the wine was, you know, when you taste wines, once in a while you go, this is damn near perfect. And it was it was a current release of Hill of Grace. And you go, yeah, there's absolute perfection. And so that had to go in there. Quick look at Cabernet Sauvignon, because it's a variety that's been around in Australia for a very, very long time. Although it took time for Cabernet to find its comfortable home in Australia. It was planted in the Barossa in the 1800s and some other places. But what we do know about Cabernet Sauvignon, it needs heat to ripen, but not too much. It needs sort of moderate climate. And so figuring out that was where, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist in some of these warmer regions, and in the cool sites within these warm regions, there's really good wine produced. But there's a couple of regions that are affected by maritime influences that really have sort of led the charge. And I'll quickly go over this slide again and just sort of point out a couple here. But Coonawarra and Margaret River are kind of what I think, first and foremost, if you remember anything about Cabernet from Australia, remember these two regions. I think they're very, very important. Coonawarra, probably the most history and reputation, but I think Margaret River, man, I tell you what, they've come sort of since the 1960s out of that, it's become one of the benchmark examples. And I think what's nice about it, even though we talk about powerful, complex Cabernet, I think comparing Coonawarra and Margaret River is fun to do. But I think what's really exciting about Cabernet in general from the better regions in Australia is it's nice to be reminded that Cabernet is a medium to full-bodied expression that has tannin, that has high tannin, has high acidity, and just a little herbal, fragrant lift. Because I think we've forgotten one of the key elements about Cabernet, and that is that herbal element, not green and unripe, but just that lovely fragrance that I think a little bit of herbaceousness can lift. And I mean, I love Napa Cab, don't get me wrong. There's so many great expressions, but there are a lot that are just ripened to the point where the tannins are soft, the fruit is super ripe, and the acidity is super low, and they're just big and they're full and they're rich. And to be brutally honest, it's red wine to me. It's not the essence of Cabernet. The essence of Cabernet has some aromatics and some structure. And I think what we're doing right now with Cabernet in some of the best regions is just that, and it's exciting. You can have, this will be on there and you can send me or Michelle emails. We're happy to answer questions. But I think quickly, other varieties, there's an excitement. I get so excited when I'm down in Australia now because there's so many style shifts and so many different varieties that are happening. In McLaren Vale, I will pick on McLaren Vale, but it's not exclusive to McLaren Vale, because you can go to a place like the Riverland, which is known for bulk production of, all the varieties you know of, yet there's this other underlying current of really interesting Mediterranean varieties. We'll take McLaren Vale because I think they've sort of led the charge. And in the ground in McLaren Vale, I could give you a dozen or so varieties, but there's been a lot of experimentation with Southern Mediterranean varieties. Why? It's not for trend and say, hey, listen, this should be fun to sell Nera d'Avola from Australia. It's not. It's about experimentation for the future, looking at all these different varieties as to what's the most suited to this changing environment. And I think that's super exciting. And then what's happened, a lot of things have been planted, and then certain things are emerging as really being successful. Fiana is one of them. Vermentino is another. Nera d'Avola. There's a lot of Tempranillo in the ground in McLaren Vale, but it seems like other varieties are sort of taking over in a way. And right now in quarantine, there are a bunch of Greek varieties, Mavro and a few others and there's a bunch of people unbelievably excited. I was with a famous master sommelier, Madeleine Truffon from the US, who's Greek background. We were driving into McLaren, she said, oh my gosh, I feel like I'm home. And because there's, I don't know about a Greek sensibility to McLaren Vale, but it feels Mediterranean. There's olive groves, there's the ocean everywhere. You can see it and smell it. And I think Michelle's point from James Halliday was, hey, Busby went to where the famous wines were. It was France. Italy was not that relevant in the 1800s. They were producing wine, but nobody knew it was where the famous wines were. So there's two things. I wish more Italian varieties came in those days. And I wish we were settled by the Italians, because our food would have been better in the early days. we had 200 years of boring British cooking. Christ.
But the food in Australia is exciting now. You have so much.
Super exciting now. Yeah.
Amazing Asian influence. And if I may just add one thing to the wave of other grapes, is that in some other parts of the world, they're trying to plant new grapes for the fun of it, and you taste it, it doesn't taste like it, and it doesn't work. I think what's amazing, I did the comparison tasting when I was there, Fiano blind, Fiano from McLaren Vale, Fiano from Campania, and it was blind. And my favorite were actually, and I love Fiano from Campania, but I was pretty impressed with the Fiano from the Fiano from McLaren Vale. So I think that these grapes work. They're not just trying to do or to be something. They actually really shine and work. So yeah.
That's great. And I think the other thing too is that Eric Asimov had not been to Australia, and he was not very positive about Australia in the past. He goes down to Australia and he gets a Nebbiolo that he's been raving about, saying, this is the first time I've ever had something outside of, and I think Nebbiolo is a tough one because we have a very small frame of reference. It sits here, sits in this little box. We know it from Piedmont, that's it. So we can't compare to anywhere else. But yet, Luke Lambert's Nebbiolo from McLaren Vale, from Yarra Valley, just like, this is hands down one of the best Nebbiolos I've had. So experiment, get out there and have a look. But I think to Michelle's point now is that for the agents in the room, we're going to try and do some work and get closer to you guys to give you some examples of some wines that would be fun to bring in, because I think it's time, and I think there's some excitement that's being missed a little bit. So
great.
Cool. Any questions?
I've been moderating. I've been answering, mostly excitement from the comments rather than question, and people sharing with us some wine they've tried, that are kind of the Nebbiolo or Pinot Meunier from Mac Forbes, and so I think a few people just sharing that with us, and I think the comments are very positive. So I hope that we gave you the taste for it, and if you're an importer to start importing some of those wines. I think that the market in Montreal is so open-minded. I think it's just about to get the wine in the glass, and I think once the wine is in the glass, that's when they change their mind. So I think we need to work on that. Mark, it's such a pleasure and really an honor to have you with us to share your knowledge. Nobody knows more about Australia than you do, so it's been a pleasure to have you. And I want to thank Wine Australia for allowing us to do that, and of course Catherine at A3 Québec for organizing all of that. And it is our last one for a while, so hopefully we see you down the road again, but it's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, it's a pleasure for me too. It's sorry, my curtain. I had this lovely curtain hiding the house back there, and it just fell. But I hope to get back up to Quebec. I've done some visits there in the last few years, and we're always trying to get there once a year. And unfortunately, with COVID, it's been a bit of a challenge. But I'm hopeful within the next 12 months we can be back in Quebec and we can do some fun, exciting things with some new wines. So anyway, pleasure. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Merci Catherine.
Merci à tout le monde. Merci.
Thank you.